3 armed men, an empty courtyard behind a mansion before dawn, and a maid standing in the middle of their closing circle with a notebook clutched against her chest. Nobody called the police, and nobody hit an alarm because in this world, the police never stepped through those gates, and the 3 men had been sent by the very person who controlled the mansion's security. She wasn't a bodyguard. She wasn't part of the organization. She was just a maid, a woman nobody had looked at twice in 3 years. But being invisible meant she had seen everything. And the only man who could save her, the feared boss who made the entire city bow its head, was 11 miles away, sitting in a meeting carefully designed so he would never come back. They had calculated every move, except for one thing. That man had never trusted a meeting that started too much on time. If this story grips you, hit like and subscribe right now so you don't miss the next one. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves stories like this. And drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. 5 weeks before that fateful morning, Maren Foley woke at 4:30 in the morning in a cramped, rented room on the south side of the city, where the whistles of freight trains drifted through windows so thin that she'd learned to recognize each passing train by its sound alone. She caught the first bus at 10 minutes before 5, transferred to a second route at the Halsted intersection, and clocked in at the Gallagher estate at exactly 6 o'clock, just as she'd done every single day for the past 3 years without being late once. That morning, while walking along the 3rd-floor hallway with a stack of fresh bed linens in her arms, she heard something so faint that almost anyone else would have walked right past it without ever noticing. It was the quiet drip of water somewhere behind the wall. Maren stopped. She rested her hand against the wall, traced the dampness spreading beneath the paint, then slipped a small notebook from the pocket of her apron and wrote in her careful, orderly handwriting, "Water pipe leaking behind the 3rd-floor hallway wall, near the small laundry room door, 6:42 in the morning." She reported it to the maintenance crew at 7 o'clock. By 9 o'clock, when the plumber confirmed the leak was exactly where she'd indicated, nobody bothered asking how she'd known. Nobody had ever asked Maren much of anything. She was the woman who poured the coffee while conversations never paused when she entered the room. She was the woman who changed the bed linens, though nobody could have remembered her face. She was the pair of steady hands that kept the entire estate running so smoothly that her very existence had become almost invisible. Her phone vibrated during her lunch break while she sat alone in the laundry room with the lunch she'd brought from home. The message came from the billing department at St. Anne Hospital, reminding her of the remaining balance on her mother's medical expenses and the due date for the next payment. Maren read every word. She didn't rush to lock the screen. Instead, she opened the small expense notebook tucked inside her handbag, crossed out one line, and carefully added another. Her mother had spent 11 months at St. Anne before she passed away, and every figure in that message represented another day. Maren had been able to sit beside her hospital bed, holding her mother's frail hand. She didn't regret a single dollar. She simply kept paying, little by little, month after month. When she folded her phone shut, the fluorescent light in the laundry room brushed across her left hand, where a thin, pale band still circled her ring finger. It was the fading mark left by the engagement ring she'd pawned 2 years earlier, along with the man who'd disappeared before that, taking every dollar she'd saved for the final semester of nursing school. Inside the drawer of her rented room, she still kept her anatomy notebook. Its cover had worn soft around the corners, and every page was filled with carefully drawn bones and muscles, labeled in the neat handwriting of a young woman in her final year who'd once believed she was only 1 semester away. She didn't open it anymore, but she'd never been able to throw it away either. That afternoon, Maren folded towels in the linen room. Mrs. Hartzell, the elderly housekeeper, had once stood watching her work and quietly said that in 40 years on the job, she'd never seen anyone fold towels so perfectly. Every fold Maren made was as straight as though measured with a ruler. Every stack lined up with flawless precision. It wasn't something she tried to do. It had simply become part of her hands, after years spent learning how to make hospital beds, arrange medical instruments in their exact order, and leave everything so perfectly organized that it could be found even in complete darkness. Some dreams never come true, but they don't really leave the people who dreamed them. They simply move to another place, changing from a diploma hanging proudly on a wall into perfectly folded white towels stacked with quiet care. On Tuesday morning, just like every Tuesday morning, Maren made pancakes in the secondary kitchen. It wasn't listed among her assigned duties. It had begun one winter morning the year before, when 8-year-old June Gallagher had wandered downstairs looking for breakfast long before the chef arrived, and Marin, the only person there at the time, had mixed some batter and made the little girl a pancake. After that, it simply became tradition. June perched happily on the tall stool beside the kitchen counter, with her feet swinging above the floor, talking excitedly about her paper star jar project at school, with the kind of wholehearted enthusiasm only children possess. Her teacher had said that anyone who folded 100 paper stars would have their jar displayed on the classroom shelf. Her friend Mia had already folded 43 stars, while June had only reached 31. Marin flipped the golden pancake in the pan and asked what color star June wanted to fold next. Ocean blue, June answered without a second's hesitation. Because the ocean is the biggest place in the whole world. The week before, while the chef prepared a strawberry dessert for a small family gathering, it was Marin who'd quietly reminded everyone that little June was allergic to strawberries, something clearly written in the kitchen records but forgotten beneath dozens of pages of paperwork. Nobody thanked her. She hadn't expected anyone to. She was simply the person who noticed what everyone else overlooked. At 7:15, the steady rhythm of footsteps echoed through the hallway, and the atmosphere inside the small kitchen shifted almost instantly. Ronan Gallagher appeared in the doorway, tall, silent, dressed in a charcoal gray suit without a single wrinkle. Marin had heard enough whispers about the man to know the stories. They said the entire city lowered its head when he passed. They said even the hardest men softened their voices whenever they spoke the Gallagher name. She instinctively stepped back and lowered her eyes toward the pan. But the man didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. He walked to his daughter, quietly said something that made June burst into gentle laughter. Then, before taking her to the car for school, he bent all the way down until one knee rested on the kitchen floor and carefully retied the loose shoelace on her little shoe. He did it slowly and neatly, tying a double bow so it wouldn't come undone, as though in that single moment, the entire city beyond those walls simply didn't exist. Marin stood beside the stove, still holding the spatula in her hand, silently taking in what she'd just witnessed, the same way she quietly observed everything else around her. The man who filled all of Chicago with fear had just knelt on one knee on a kitchen floor to tie his daughter's shoe. She had no idea that 5 weeks later, that very man would become the only thing standing between her and 3 gun barrels in an empty courtyard. Right then, she saw nothing more than a father. And somehow, for one very brief moment, that was enough to make the cold, enormous estate feel almost like a home. That Thursday afternoon, Marin was asked to bring coffee to the reading room in the West Wing, the oak-paneled room where the organization's men always gathered to discuss business she'd never wanted to understand. She knocked twice, pushed the serving cart inside, and began pouring coffee into the first cup according to the same routine she'd followed for 3 years. Guests first, master of the house last, never looking anyone in the eye, never making a sound she didn't have to make. There were 2 men in the room. Cormac Burns sat in the familiar leather chair beside the fireplace, a silver-haired man whose quiet gaze rested on the flames, the Gallagher family's trusted advisor for 15 years. The man every employee in the estate knew answered only to the boss himself. The other man sat with his back to the door. She'd never seen him inside the estate before. He had broad shoulders, the collar of his coat turned up, the kind of man whose eyes swept across objects without ever lingering on them. Neither of them stopped talking when she entered. To them, she was simply another part of the serving cart, a moving mechanism that happened to pour coffee, and because of that, they continued speaking in voices just loud enough to carry through the quiet room. After Friday's peace meeting, Gallagher won't be running this city anymore, Cormac said slowly, as casually as though he were commenting on the weather. The other man asked something so quietly that Marin couldn't catch every word. As long as the shipment is switched before he sits down at the table, Cormac replied. It won't matter whether he suspects anything or not. The paperwork will only point in one direction. The coffee pot in Marin's hands didn't tremble even once. She filled the second cup, exactly 2/3 full, just as it was always served. She placed the sugar bowl and the small pitcher of cream to the guest's right, straightened the folded linen beneath the tray until every edge lined up perfectly, then quietly pushed the cart out of the room and closed the door so gently that it didn't make the slightest click. She walked down the hallway without changing her pace, descended the servants' staircase, crossed the kitchen, entered the laundry room, and closed the door behind her. Then she stood perfectly still among stacks of neatly folded white towels, both hands gripping the edge of the ironing table, listening to her heart pounding like footsteps racing across old wooden stairs. Gallagher won't be running this city anymore. She understood exactly what those words meant in this world. Somewhere else, when people lost power, they packed their offices and walked away. In the world beyond the estate gates, people didn't walk away. They disappeared. Maren closed her eyes, and just as her mind always did whenever her body faced something too heavy to bear, her memories carried her back 14 months, to the day she'd learned the lesson that changed the way she survived inside this house. That day, an envelope filled with cash disappeared from the desk inside the small second-floor office. It was the estate manager's weekly expense money, and the last person officially recorded entering the room to clean had been the maid, Maren Foley. She still remembered standing inside the manager's office, listening to the same questions repeated over and over again. She remembered the way people's eyes changed after only one morning. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody openly accused her. But she could feel the ground beneath her feet growing thinner with every passing hour, because inside a house like this, suspicion wasn't something that got people fired. Suspicion was something people didn't survive. She'd escaped, not because someone had proven her innocent, but because of the small notebook she'd carried ever since nursing school, where she'd written down the cleaning schedule for every room, along with the exact times she entered and left. A mechanical habit left behind by the nursing student who'd once been taught that every procedure performed on a patient had to be recorded with its precise time. Her notes proved she'd left the office at 9:20, while the estate manager confirmed he'd still seen the envelope at 10 minutes before 10. The matter was dismissed. People called it a simple misplacement, and nobody ever mentioned it again. But Maren remembered. She remembered that morning, before she'd entered the office to clean. She'd walked down the hallway and seen Cormac Byrne, stepping out of that very room, with his right hand tucked inside the pocket of his coat, passing her as though he were walking past empty air. She'd never told anyone what she'd seen, saying it would have been suicide. A maid accusing the boss's closest advisor without evidence and without witnesses would have been signing her own death warrant, so she'd stayed silent. And from that day on, her notebook grew thicker. She wrote down everything. The late-night phone calls she overheard while dusting the staircase. The unfamiliar vehicles parked at the service gate during hours when no deliveries were scheduled. The numbers she was asked to copy into the estate's expense ledger that never quite added up, always off by a small amount, small enough that nobody questioned it, regular enough that it couldn't possibly be an accident. She hadn't written those things for any particular purpose. She wrote them because she'd come to understand something nobody had ever taught in any classroom. That for invisible people, memories written down were the only shield they had, that when the ground beneath their feet became thin again, they wouldn't be standing there empty-handed. And now, standing inside the laundry room with Cormac's words still echoing through her mind, Maren realized that shield had suddenly become as heavy as stone, because she knew something Cormac himself had probably forgotten while speaking in front of her as though she were nothing more than another piece of furniture. Inside this estate, the man who arranged every security shift, who decided which guard stood at which gate, and exactly what time each rotation changed, had never been Ronan Gallagher. That man was Cormac Byrne, which meant that if something happened behind these gates, it would happen at exactly the hour and in exactly the corner of the courtyard that Cormac wanted, and not a single camera, not a single guard would ever see it. Maren opened her notebook and looked at the neat lines that now filled page after page across 14 months, and for the very first time she understood that what she held in her hands was no longer just her own shield. It was the life of the man who'd knelt on the kitchen floor to tie his daughter's shoe, and it was the whole world of the little girl who was still patiently folding her ocean blue paper stars. That night, Maren didn't sleep. She sat at the folding table inside her tiny rented room with her notebook open in front of her, carefully weighing every path a woman like her could possibly take. The first path was the police station. It was the very first thing she'd considered, just as anyone raised believing the law was the last place left to turn would have done. But she'd lived in this estate for 3 years now, long enough to overhear scraps of conversation drifting across the guard's dining table, stories about certain names inside the police department receiving an envelope every month, and the man delivering those envelopes wasn't the boss. It was the silver-haired advisor who personally handled the things that required clean hands on paper. If a maid walked into a police station carrying a handwritten notebook accusing Cormac Byrne, then before her report ever reached the desk of anyone honest, word would have raced back to the estate faster than the bus that carried her home every evening. The second path was to disappear. She'd considered that one too. honestly and methodically, writing it down the way she'd once listed medications for a patient. The money left in her bank account after this month's payment was nothing more than a small remainder, nowhere near enough to buy a ticket far away and pay 3 months of security deposit in any city where she might begin again. Her mother's hospital debt was still legally hers. Running meant defaulting. Defaulting meant the name Maren Foley would follow her everywhere she tried to rebuild her life. And the dream of returning to nursing school, the dream she'd hidden at the bottom of her drawer beside the worn anatomy notebook, would close forever. But it wasn't the numbers that kept her where she was. What held her there was the image of a little girl perched on a tall stool every Tuesday morning, counting her ocean blue paper stars, completely unaware that her whole world was being bargained away inside an oak-paneled room in the West Wing. If Maren disappeared, June would still come downstairs the following Tuesday, and nobody would be waiting in the kitchen. And if what Cormac had said became reality, then pancakes wouldn't be the only thing that little girl lost. The third path, the easiest of them all, was silence. Keep pouring coffee, keep folding towels, keep lowering her head like another piece of furniture while powerful men destroyed one another inside their own world. Nobody could blame a maid for doing nothing. But Maren sat staring at her notebook and realized something she couldn't force herself to ignore. Doing nothing was also a choice. It wasn't as neutral as people liked to believe. It carried its own weight, and she'd have to carry that weight through every remaining Tuesday morning of her life whenever she looked at an empty high chair. The next morning she went to work with her decision already taking shape, but fate decided to test her one more time. As she stepped out of the West Wing reading room after its routine cleaning, where she'd lingered a little longer than necessary beside the leather chair near the fireplace, just to make certain her memory hadn't invented anything, she nearly collided with Mrs. Hartzell as she rounded the hallway corner. The elderly housekeeper stood there, exactly where Maren had just come from, her hands folded neatly over her apron, looking at her with an expression Maren had never seen during the past 3 years. It wasn't anger, it wasn't suspicion, but it couldn't be read either. It was as though the old woman were silently weighing something invisible between her weathered hands. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartzell," Maren said. The housekeeper nodded very slowly. "Finished cleaning the reading room already, dear?" she asked in the same ordinary voice she always used. But her eyes remained on Maren for one heartbeat longer before she finally turned away and walked toward the West Wing. Maren remained standing alone in the hallway, a cold shiver creeping along her spine, wondering how long the old woman had been standing there, what she'd seen, and what secret those impossible eyes were carrying behind their quiet gaze. She refused to let herself think any further. Thinking further would have made her hesitate, and she no longer had time to hesitate. That night, she carefully copied a single page from 14 months of notes in neat block letters instead of her usual handwriting, selecting each detail the way a nurse chose the right medicine for a patient fighting for life. The shipment at the harbor whose container seal had been switched, along with its exact container number, the repeated discrepancy in the estate expense ledger, recorded with precise dates, the unfamiliar vehicle at the service gate, and the license plate she'd memorized by heart, and finally, the words she'd overheard inside the reading room. "This Friday. Peace meeting. The shipment will be switched before anyone sits down at the table." She signed nothing. There wasn't a single word revealing who'd written it. The following afternoon, she waited for the exact window of time that 3 years inside the estate had taught her by heart, about 20 minutes before the boss returned from the harbor, when his second-floor office sat empty and the hallway guard went downstairs for the shift change. She walked upstairs carrying a stack of freshly folded towels, the invisible passport every maid carried through the house, and stopped before the heavy wooden door. 40 seconds. She stood there for 40 seconds with one hand resting on the doorknob, hearing every beat of her heart striking against her ribs like someone knocking on a locked gate. 40 seconds to understand that once this piece of paper rested on that desk, there'd be no turning back. She'd no longer be invisible. She'd become a piece on a chessboard where pieces disappeared without anyone needing a reason. She thought of her mother. She thought of the pale band still circling her ring finger. She thought of the truth she'd finally accepted, that doing nothing was also a choice. Then she opened the door, crossed the thick carpet without making a sound, placed the folded sheet of paper neatly in the very center of the wooden desk, where the first glance of the man sitting there couldn't possibly miss it, then quietly walked back out, closed the door behind her, and continued down the hallway carrying her stack of towels, with the same steady pace as any ordinary maid going about her ordinary work. Nobody looked at her. For 3 years, nobody had looked at her. and for the very first time, she silently prayed that would remain true just one more time. Ronan Gallagher returned to his office at dusk after a day at the harbor, with numbers that refused to settle in his mind, and he noticed the folded sheet of paper lying in the very center of his desk before he even had time to take off his coat. He didn't touch it immediately. He stood beside the desk, his eyes sweeping across the room with the habit of a man who'd survived long enough in this world to know that anything unfamiliar appearing inside his territory had to be studied from a distance before it was examined up close. The curtains still hung in exactly the same folds. The drawers hadn't been disturbed. The pen still rested at the same slight angle on the tray where he'd left it that morning. Only the paper was new. He sat down, unfolded it, and read it. The first time, he saw carefully printed lines describing a shipment whose seal had been switched, complete with the exact container number down to every single character, the recurring discrepancies in the estate's expense ledger, an unfamiliar vehicle parked at the service gate, and the final line stating that this Friday, during the peace meeting, a shipment would be switched before anyone sat down at the table. The second time, he wasn't reading the words anymore. He was reading the person who'd written them. The block letters had been deliberately chosen to disguise the writer's real handwriting, yet they were unusually precise. Every line was perfectly aligned, as though measured with a ruler. Every piece of information had been arranged in chronological order with exact dates and times. This wasn't the work of someone acting in haste to stir up trouble. It was the work of someone trained to record details with absolute accuracy. More importantly, that container number matched the very shipment he'd begun questioning 3 weeks earlier, when the harbor records had shown a discrepancy so small that every one of his managers had dismissed it as nothing more than a weighing error. The third time, he read it looking for the trap, because his profession had taught him that the gift arriving at exactly the right moment was usually the most dangerous one. An anonymous message appearing just before the peace meeting could easily be Rizzo's way of making him doubt his own people. Turning a man's own weapon against him was an old move, but it had never stopped working. Then he flicked open his silver lighter, touched the flame to one corner of the page, and watched it burn completely inside the brass ashtray. Because whether the paper held the truth or a trap, it couldn't be allowed to exist inside a room entered every week by eyes that didn't belong to him. But its contents were already stored inside his memory, every single line intact. The following morning, he summoned Wade Kelleher to his office, not through the estate telephone, but with a message sent to a private device only the two of them knew existed. Wade was one of the very few men Ronan still allowed himself to trust. Not because they'd worked together for 10 years, but because 3 years earlier, after the day his wife's car had plunged from the Ashland Bridge and his entire world had shattered into pieces, Ronan had quietly done something nobody inside the organization had been allowed to participate in, not even Cormac. He'd secretly assembled a mobile security unit, made up entirely of men who had no ties whatsoever to the old network. He paid them from his own private funds. Their names appeared on none of the estate's security schedules. They took orders from only one man, Wade, and Wade answered to only one man, Ronan himself. At the time, he'd told himself he'd done it for June, because a little girl who'd lost her mother deserved protection without a single weakness. But beneath that, inside the instinctive part of him he'd never put into words, he'd done it because of a question that had never stopped living inside his chest. Why had that car crossed that bridge at precisely the hour it never should have been there? "Watch the maid from the 3rd floor," he told Wade. "Her name is Marin Foley. 3 days. Completely invisible. I want to know who she meets, who she calls, and where every dollar she spends goes." Wade didn't ask why. He simply nodded and disappeared. That was why he'd remained beside Ronan all these years. 3 days later, Wade returned carrying a thin stack of photographs and a report even thinner. Day 1. She took 2 buses to the estate and arrived at 6 o'clock. Returned to her rented room at 7 in the evening. Stopped nowhere. Met no one. Day 2. Exactly the same, except for one stop at a grocery store where she bought flour, eggs, and a pack of ocean blue craft paper. Day 3 was her day off. That morning she rode a bus to the cemetery outside the city, stood for 20 minutes beside the grave of a woman whose name was carved into the headstone, wiped the stone clean with a cloth she'd brought herself. That afternoon she went to St. Anne Hospital, stood in line at the cashier's window, and paid part of her mother's medical debt in cash, smoothing every $50 bill flat and counting them twice before sliding them beneath the glass. Wade placed a photograph on the desk. Taken from a distance, it showed the thin woman in her worn coat, standing before the cashier's window with her back perfectly straight. No unusual phone activity, no suspicious bank accounts, not a single dollar moving in or out except her monthly wages and debt payments, Wade said. She's so clean it's hard for me to believe. Ronan stared at the photograph for a long time. In his world, someone who appeared impossibly clean usually meant the image had been carefully manufactured. But nobody spent 3 years building a false identity by paying a dead mother's hospital debt $50 at a time. False identities were built from things people could see. What stood inside this photograph had been built from years nobody had ever bothered to see. That afternoon, Marin was summoned to the second-floor office. When she stepped inside, quietly closed the door behind her, and stood straight before his desk with both hands folded in front of her apron. Ronan said nothing during the first 10 seconds. He simply slid a sheet of paper across the desk. It was an exact copy of every line from the anonymous message that had already turned to ashes, rewritten entirely from memory in his own hand. He watched her pupils tighten the instant she recognized its contents. He noticed her fingers gripping the fabric of her apron just a little more firmly. But she didn't step back. She didn't deny anything. She didn't rush to defend herself. That told him more than any confession ever could. "What do you want?" he asked. Just one question, spoken in the same voice that had forced the toughest men in the city to weigh every word before answering him. Marin Foley lifted her eyes and answered without rushing and without hesitation. "I don't want anything. I just don't want to pretend I didn't see it." The room fell silent. And in that silence, Ronan Gallagher did something he realized he'd never done during the entire 3 years she'd lived under his roof. He looked at her. Truly looked at her. Not the way he'd glanced past another moving piece of furniture, but at the woman standing before him, with dark circles beneath her eyes from too many sleepless nights, shoulders that were thin yet unbending, and eyes that didn't lower beneath his gaze, something even armed men rarely managed to hold. She'd lived in his house for 3 years, and he'd never truly seen her, just as he'd failed to see so many other things unfolding inside his own home. The realization cut deeper than he cared to admit. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "From this moment forward," he said slowly, every word falling onto the desk like pieces placed upon a chessboard. "You'll tell me everything you've seen, every detail, every date, every hour. I'll verify every single line. If even one detail is wrong, just one, you'll leave this estate tonight and you'll never come back. But if every word proves true, you'll continue doing exactly what you've done for the past 3 years, cleaning, pouring coffee, and remaining invisible to everyone." He paused for a heartbeat. "There's only one difference. From now on, everything those eyes see belongs to me." Marin looked across the wooden desk at him and nodded once, briefly, the way someone signed an agreement that existed without paper. Outside the windows, the city lights were beginning to glow. Neither of them knew that in the oak-paneled room of the West Wing, a man was slowly turning a gold ring around his finger while adding one more line to a plan that now stood only 2 weeks away from the peace meeting. They never met again inside his office, because without either of them saying it aloud, they both understood that a maid summoned to the boss's office twice in the same week would have been the sort of detail no pair of watchful eyes inside the estate would overlook. Instead, they built a language without words, and it was Marin who invented it. Inside the West Wing reading room, where she cleaned every morning and Ronan still stopped by every afternoon out of long-established habit, there was always a white handkerchief resting on the small table beside the window, an ordinary object so unremarkable that nobody ever gave it a second glance. Folded into 3, everything was safe. Folded into 2, she had new information to pass along. No handkerchief on the table meant danger. Do not approach under any circumstances. To anyone else, a white handkerchief on the window table was completely ordinary, just another minor detail left behind by a diligent maid. Only 2 people inside the estate could read it as a message being rewritten every single day. Along with that came a signal for situations too urgent to wait until the next cleaning schedule. Ronan gave her a phone number that existed in no contact list anywhere, and together they agreed on a sequence of signals that would have meant nothing, even if some machine happened to record them. 2 missed calls in a row, a pause, then 1 more missed call. It meant every plan stopped. It meant something had happened. It meant he had to come back immediately. She memorized the sequence after hearing it only once, without writing it down anywhere, and he realized this woman stored important things the same way he'd once been taught to do, in the only place nobody could ever search. Everything else passed through what he later came to call, in the privacy of his own thoughts, the 2-minute windows. Her cleaning schedule ran with the precision of a clock. His movements through the estate followed the same rhythm. By shifting each schedule only a few minutes, those 2 straight lines crossed at places nobody would find unusual. The second-floor hallway, while he walked from the dining room back toward his office, and she wiped down the staircase railing. The courtyard while he headed for his car, and she gathered the table linens from the terrace. Each meeting lasted no longer than 2 minutes. Nobody stopped walking. Nobody looked directly at the other. Only brief sentences drifted through the space between 2 people apparently occupied with their own work. "There's a second phone taped beneath the desk in the small second-floor office," she said during their first passing encounter. Black tape. Left side. Right against the leg of the desk. 3 days later, Wade confirmed it was exactly where she'd described it. A prepaid phone with no registration. And on Ronan's orders, nobody touched it. "Leave it exactly where it is, like a snake that's already been marked." Last quarter's expense ledger contains a small discrepancy repeated 9 times, she told him during another brief encounter. "It always happens on the days shipments arrive through the service gate. The difference is less than 1%, small enough for accounting to ignore, regular enough that it can't be an accident." He had his own people quietly review every page through channels no one else knew existed, and every number she'd given him held firm like nails driven into wood. He began waiting for those 2-minute windows the way a chess player waited for the move of the only teammate he had left, and perhaps, though he still couldn't find the right name for it, in another way as well. Because even during those days stretched as tightly as piano wire, life inside the estate continued flowing, and it was within that ordinary current that the 2 of them began seeing each other more clearly with every passing day. One afternoon, while passing the secondary kitchen on his way to the garage, Ronan slowed outside the doorway. Inside, Marin and June sat side by side at the kitchen table. Between them lay a stack of ocean blue craft paper, and Marin gently held his daughter's hands, guiding each careful fold. "Right here. Fold it over, then turn it back. Press the crease nice and straight, and your star will puff up beautifully." June bit her lip in concentration as though she were performing the most important task in the world, then burst into delighted laughter when the tiny paper star blossomed round in her palm. "I did it, Miss Marin. I have 39 stars now." He stood there longer than he'd intended, watching his daughter smile, the smile he'd feared would slowly disappear after her mother died. Watching the woman patiently smoothing every fold of paper as though nothing else in the world demanded urgency, then quietly walked away before either of them noticed him, carrying with him something unexpectedly heavy settling deep inside his chest. As for Marin, one evening she stayed late preparing table linens for the following day's gathering. While walking through the dimly lit second-floor hallway after most of the lights had been lowered, she came upon a sight that stopped her behind the corner of the wall. Ronan Gallagher sat on the hardwood floor beside the half-closed door to June's bedroom. His suit jacket rested across his knees. His head leaned lightly against the wall. No phone, no paperwork. He simply sat there within the soft glow spilling from the little bedside lamp inside the room, listening to the steady breathing of his sleeping daughter like a soldier assigned to a watch nobody had ordered him to keep, quietly taking the same shift every single night. The man who made an entire city bow its head sat on the floor guarding the sleep of one little girl, and he looked lonelier than anyone Marin had ever met in her life. She quietly stepped back and slipped away without making a sound. But later that night, riding the last bus home, she realized she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd seen, about the strange truth that inside this magnificent estate lived 2 people who both knew what it meant to eat dinner alone in silence, who both understood what it was like to carry an entire world upon their shoulders without ever allowing another soul to see them grow tired. Neither of them spoke of it. There were no promises, no lingering glances lasting longer than a heartbeat. There was only the white handkerchief lying neatly folded into 3 every morning upon the reading room table, like a quiet greeting exchanged between 2 unlikely allies, and perhaps like something else neither of them yet dared to name. Meanwhile, in the West Wing, the advisor's gold ring continued turning around his finger, and the calendar on his desk now carried a circle in bright red ink. There were only 11 days left until the Friday peace meeting. Over the next 10 days, Ronan did the one thing he'd always done better than anyone ever since taking this city from his father's hands. He followed the money, the pieces Marin had quietly passed to him through their 2-minute windows spread across his mind like a map, the container number attached to the shipment with the switched seal. The 9 small discrepancies in the estate's expense records that always appeared on the exact day's deliveries entered through the service gate. The unfamiliar vehicle, whose license plate Wade traced to a small transportation company on the south side. And when Ronan laid every piece beside the harbor records from the past 2 years, a pattern slowly emerged that sent an icy chill through his blood. It hadn't been one shipment. It had been 4. 4 shipments over 2 years. Every one of them happened during weeks when he'd been away from the city or completely consumed by another crisis. Every one carried cargo of exceptional value and nearly impossible to trace. Every one had its seal switched at the same dock during inventory shifts staffed by personnel assigned through the advisor's office. And the discrepancy, officially recorded in the books as transportation losses within acceptable limits, quietly flowed into an intermediary company with a harmless name like every shell company in the world. It took Wade 3 days to strip away that disguise, and what lay beneath it forced even the seasoned head of security to read the documents twice. The company belonged on paper to a man who'd been buried 6 years earlier, a name lifted from a graveyard, resurrected on legal documents, complete with signatures, bank accounts, and incoming payments. And those signatures, when Ronan placed them beneath the light beside one another, ended with the same familiar flourish he'd seen for 15 years on every document Cormac Byrne had ever placed upon his desk. He didn't need a handwriting expert, but the deepest wound wasn't the money. Wade laid a long-distance photograph of the unfamiliar vehicle at the service gate on the desk, enlarged the face of the man sitting in the passenger seat, and spoke in the calm voice of someone long accustomed to delivering terrible news. This man is one of Sal Rizzo's closest lieutenants. He runs the southern shipping routes, which means what leaves our service gate isn't just cargo. It's information, shipping schedules, transportation routes, departure times. The very things that over the past 2 years have allowed 3 shipments belonging to your allies to be intercepted in ways that looked far too coincidental. Ronan remained motionless for a long time, staring at the photographs and documents spread before him. For 15 years, that man had sat at the right side of his dining table. He'd straightened Ronan's tie on the day of his father's funeral. He'd stood behind his shoulder through every negotiation where lives hung in the balance. And through those same 15 years, stitch by careful stitch, he'd woven a net around the Gallagher family, until only now was Ronan beginning to see its first threads. He wanted to believe he was wrong. The part of him that still remembered Cormac carrying baby June in his arms wanted desperately to believe he was wrong. But the other part, the part that had kept him alive through every one of these years, answered him with a voice as cold and flat as steel. Every road leads to the same door. The problem was that everything lying on his desk, the photographs, the accounting comparisons, the conclusions drawn from the signatures, amounted to nothing more than the shadow of a crime, not the hand holding the knife. Even in Ronan's world there were laws. They weren't written anywhere, but they were harder than steel. To bring down a man in Cormac's position before the other leaders, especially before Sal Rizzo at the peace table, required evidence nobody could argue against. Black ink on white paper bearing fresh signatures, not suspicion, and that evidence existed. It was Marin who told him where to find it during one of their 2-minute windows in the second-floor hallway. Her voice remained low and even, as though she were simply reading a laundry inventory. He keeps a black leather ledger. I've seen it 3 times while cleaning his room. Every time it was in the same place. Once the wine seal on the cabinet had shifted. Behind that wine cabinet there's an empty space. The wall sounds different when you knock on it. Then she added something she'd once heard with her own ears while Cormac spoke to the stranger inside the reading room. Almost like a personal philosophy. He never puts anything important on a computer because computers can be copied from far away. Paper can't. Paper never betrays its owner. If someone wants the paper, they have to walk through his door. That night, Ronan and Wade worked through every possible plan for getting someone inside that room, only to crash into the wall both men already knew had been built by the same person they were trying to investigate. Cormac's private suite sat at the end of the west wing hallway. Reaching it meant passing 2 interior security posts and hallway cameras. Every guard shift, every patrol route, every scheduled rotation throughout the estate existed on the weekly security chart prepared by the advisor's office itself. Sending any member of the organization anywhere near that door, even the most skilled among them, would have created an irregularity the moment that man's routine assignment changed. And Cormac read those schedules every morning with the same attention other men gave the newspaper. Wade's independent security team was clean, but precisely because they were clean, their faces were unfamiliar. A stranger walking through the estate would have been remembered before his hand ever touched the doorknob. The 2 men sat over the estate's floor plans until nearly midnight, and every plan died at exactly the same point. Nobody could reach that door without leaving a ripple upon the surface of the lake Cormac watched so carefully. It was then, during their 2-minute window the following morning, when Ronan told her, in the weary voice of a man who'd exhausted every move, that there was simply no way to get anyone into that room, that Maren finished wiping down the wooden table, folded the cloth in her hands into perfect squares, and quietly spoke the sentence that stopped him cold in the middle of the hallway. "There's one person who goes into that room every single day without anyone remembering," she said. "The woman who changes the bed linens, empties the ashtray, dusts the wine cabinet. The woman every camera has recorded for 3 years, and nobody has ever bothered rewinding the footage, because she's simply part of the room, like the curtains, like the rug." She raised her eyes to his, one of the rare moments their gazes met for longer than a single heartbeat in broad daylight. "You don't need to send anyone in," she said. "I'm already in there." But Cormac Byrne hadn't survived 15 years in this world through luck alone, and while Ronan was still weighing Maren's offer, the advisor made a move no one saw coming, because it wasn't aimed at the boss. It was aimed at the boss's eyes. It began with a thin brown file that appeared on Ronan's desk one morning, carried upstairs by a mid-level manager from the finance office, accompanied by an uneasy explanation that the department's routine audit had stumbled across something unusual involving one of the estate employees, and they believed the boss needed to know. Inside was a copy of a statement from St. Anne Hospital, and the words on the page seemed to lower the temperature of the room by several degrees. A substantial portion of the medical debt under Maren Foley's name had been paid the previous week in cash through an intermediary law office. The person making the payment had left no name. The amount equaled nearly 3 years of a maid's salary. Ronan read the document twice and felt an icy hand close around the back of his neck. He'd investigated this woman. He'd studied the photograph of her standing with her back perfectly straight before the cashier's window, counting $50 bills one by one. He'd believed in something built over years no one had ever bothered to notice. And now the paper before him claimed that during the very days she'd begun feeding him information, a large anonymous payment had quietly entered her life. In his profession, coincidence was a luxury no one could afford to believe in. A maid drowning in debt suddenly found most of it erased at precisely the moment she stood between two powerful factions. The oldest lesson of the underworld echoed through his mind as clearly as a church bell. If you want to know who's feeding a fish, watch who throws food into the water. And if Rizzo was the one scattering the bait, then everything she'd handed him over the past 2 weeks, including the ledger hidden behind the wine cabinet, could very well be nothing more than a carefully prepared trap designed to make him destroy his own house with his own hands. That afternoon, Maren was summoned to the second-floor office for only the second time in her life, and the moment she stepped through the door, she knew something had gone terribly wrong. The curtains had been drawn. Wade Kelleher stood just to the right of the desk, with both arms hanging naturally at his sides, one hand resting casually near his waist. The man behind the desk didn't invite her to sit. Ronan slid the brown file across the desk in exactly the same way he'd once pushed the handwritten note toward her. But the look in his eyes was no longer the one she'd seen that afternoon. It was flat and cold like the surface of a frozen January lake. "Explain it," he said. "Just 2 words." Maren opened the file and read the line describing the payment against her debt. During the first few seconds, she understood nothing. During the next few seconds, she understood everything. She understood where the money had come from. She understood why it had been paid. She understood that the noose around her neck had been tied so skillfully, she hadn't even realized it had slipped into place the week before. And she understood that every explanation beginning with, "I don't know anything," would be exactly what a guilty person would have said first. She looked up and saw Wade's hand still resting near his waist. She saw the man behind the desk waiting. Then she did the only thing she'd ever known how to do whenever the ground beneath her feet grew dangerously thin. She didn't defend herself with words. "Please allow me to retrieve something from the employee locker," she said, her voice steady. 5 minutes. "You may send someone with me." Wade looked at Ronan. Ronan gave the slightest nod. 5 minutes later, Maren returned and placed 2 things on the wooden desk: a small cloth-covered expense notebook worn soft around the edges, and a thick paper envelope. She opened the notebook first. Every lined page was filled with perfectly ordered handwriting. Every line recorded a debt payment. Date, time, cashier number, the cashier's name whenever she'd managed to read the name tag, the amount, always in $50 bills. The entries stretched backward over 3 full years, without missing a single month, even during the month she'd been too sick to work for 4 days. The notebook clearly recorded that the payment had been made 3 days late along with the reason. Then she emptied the envelope. Receipt after receipt spilled onto the desk in chronological order, forming a perfectly squared stack. Every receipt lay perfectly flat, as though carefully pressed. The oldest had already yellowed with age. The newest was only 10 days old. The red stamp from St. Anne's billing office repeated across the pages like the heartbeat on a cardiac monitor. "If I'd sold information to someone else for a payment this large," Marin said slowly, pronouncing every word with perfect clarity, "then, sir, I wouldn't have spent 3 years paying that debt with $50 bills, one payment at a time. Tomorrow I'll still go to cashier window number 3 exactly as scheduled, because I never accepted the payment someone made on my behalf. I'll ask the hospital to return every dollar to the law office that delivered it. Whoever that generous stranger may be deserves to have the money back." The room fell so silent that the ticking clock on the wall became audible. Ronan looked at the stack of receipts. He looked at the perfectly flattened sheets, smoothed by the very same hands that folded every towel in his estate into flawless right angles, and something inside him shifted. Not softened, sharpened. Because at last he saw the move from the other side of the board in its entirety, cold enough to send another chill through him. Whoever had paid that money had never intended to buy Marin Foley. Buying a woman who'd spent 3 years paying off debt $50 at a time would have been impossible, and that man had known it. He hadn't paid the money so she'd accept it. He'd paid it so Ronan would see it. He didn't need her to betray him. He only needed Ronan to believe she had. And if that morning Ronan had followed the oldest lesson of the underworld, then by now the only pair of eyes inside the estate still capable of seeing the truth would have been removed by his own hand, quietly, cleanly, without costing the other side a single bullet. "Wade," he said. The head of security's hand left his waist. "Find the law office that delivered that payment. Use outside channels. Leave no trace." Then he looked at Marin, who still stood straight behind the wall of receipts she'd built with 3 years of patient endurance. And for the first time since the brown file had landed on his desk, warmth returned to his voice. "Do you understand what just happened?" he asked. "Yes," she answered. "Someone just tried to use your hand to do his work for him." Ronan nodded slowly, stacked the receipts neatly together, slid them back toward her along with the notebook, and as she reached out to take them, he added words she'd remember for the rest of her life. "From today forward, if anything unexpectedly good ever falls into your life, money, a gift, good news with no clear source, you tell me before you even have time to be happy about it. Because in this game, the deadliest attack they'll ever use against you won't look like a bullet. It'll look like a favor." Marin gathered the notebook and the envelope against her chest and nodded. As she closed the office door behind her and stepped into the hallway, they both understood something neither of them spoke aloud. The suspicion that had just passed between them hadn't driven them apart. It had forged the bond between them in fire, and the trust that emerged from those flames weighed twice as much as trust freely given. Meanwhile, in the West Wing, when whispers about the stack of receipts reached the advisor through the finance manager, Cormac Byrne sat silently beside the fireplace for a long while, turning the gold ring around his finger exactly 3 times before speaking a single sentence to the flames. "So the girl is more careful than I thought." And the calendar on his desk showed only 8 days remaining. 2 days after that confrontation, while Marin was organizing linens in the storage room at the end of the first-floor hallway, the door behind her closed with barely a whisper. When she turned around, Mrs. Hartzell was standing between her and the exit, her hands folded neatly over her apron as always. But the old woman's eyes carried the same unreadable look Marin had seen that morning at the bend in the hallway. For a single heartbeat, Marin felt her blood turn cold. She'd heard the whispers around the estate. The elderly housekeeper belonged to the old days. She'd lived here since before the current master of the house had even been born, and nobody knew whose side she truly stood on inside this house built upon layer after layer of secrets. "Don't be afraid, Mrs." Hartzell said, her voice so soft it almost disappeared beneath the steady hum of the dryers beyond the wall. "I've been watching you for weeks now. Close enough to know what you've been doing, long enough to be certain of one thing." Then she stepped forward, slipped her wrinkled hands between 2 stacks of bed linens on the highest shelf, a place even Marin rarely touched, and carefully pulled out something wrapped inside a faded piece of linen cloth, tied with crossed strings as carefully as someone dressing a wound. She placed it into Marin's hands, and those old hands were trembling. "It belonged to the lady of the house," she whispered. Mrs. Gallagher, June's mother. Marin stood motionless among the shelves of white linen as she untied each careful knot. The aged cloth unfolded to reveal a wine-colored leather notebook, worn soft around the corners. The kind of expensive journal a refined woman would have carried. But when Marin opened the first page, what greeted her wasn't the diary of a wealthy lady. It was something that made her recognize herself with frightening clarity. Perfectly aligned columns, dates along the left margin, events recorded in the center. Question marks scribbled beside the edges. The handwriting was elegant and slanted, but the structure was identical to the notebook hidden inside Marin's apron pocket. It belonged to someone following a trail through darkness, trying desperately to keep her mind steady by forcing her thoughts into straight lines. She kept reading, and every page carried her backward 3 years into the past. That woman had noticed discrepancies in the family accounts before the accountants themselves. She'd recorded the license plate of an unfamiliar vehicle at the service gate. She'd circled the name of a small transportation company on the south side of the city, the very same name Marin had heard Wade mention only the week before. In one corner, she'd pressed her pen so hard it nearly tore through the paper. Ask C about Tuesday night's security shift. Why was the assignment changed without telling anyone? As Marin reached the final pages, the entries became shorter, more hurried, like the breathing of someone walking faster and faster, until finally she reached the last page containing words. Only 2 lines remained. Tomorrow I'll give everything to R. I can't wait any longer. Beneath those words was a date. Marin stared at it, and the floor beneath her seemed to tilt. Because during her 3 years working inside the estate, she'd heard enough whispered fragments to know that only 1 day after the date written on that page, Mrs. Gallagher's car had gone over the Ashland Bridge on a clear afternoon beneath dry skies, and the official report had called it nothing more than a loss of control. I found it 1 week after the funeral, Mrs. Hartzell said quietly behind her, her voice still low but now beginning to tremble. It was tucked behind the back of the vanity drawer, somewhere only the woman cleaning the room would have ever reached. I meant to give it to the master that very night. Then I stood at the top of the staircase with the notebook hidden inside my apron, and looked down into the entrance hall. I saw the man standing beside him throughout the funeral, the man pouring him whiskey, the man resting a hand on his shoulder, the very same man whose name appeared throughout these pages, disguised as a single letter, and I understood that if I gave it to the master at the wrong moment, while his heart had been shattered by his wife's death and while he trusted that man more than he trusted himself, then this notebook would have become nothing more than a death warrant for the next person. And the next person might not even have been me. It could have been anyone whose name appeared inside these pages. So I hid it, she said. For 3 years, hidden among these stacks of linens where nobody except me ever reached. During those 3 years, I watched every soul inside this house searching for hands clean enough and a mind steady enough to receive it. I'm old now, my eyesight has faded, but there's one thing I've never mistaken. The way someone cleans a house tells you exactly how they'll treat the truth. And you're the only person I've ever seen straighten a towel even when nobody is watching. Marin stood there holding the notebook that had belonged to the dead woman, and a terrible truth settled across her shoulders like a burial shroud. The road she was walking wasn't new. Someone else had walked it before her. Someone whose footsteps matched her own. A woman who'd noticed the same crooked numbers. A woman who'd written down the license plate of the same unfamiliar vehicle. A woman who'd questioned the same altered security shifts. A woman who'd decided to speak the truth. And that road had ended beneath the Ashland Bridge on a bright, cloudless afternoon. She walked this path before me, Marin thought. Every single step. And her final step is the one I'm about to take. That night, she carried the notebook home to her rented room and placed it beside her own notebook on the folding table. 2 notebooks. 2 women. 3 years apart. Identical down to the way each margin had been ruled. She sat before them for a long time, listening to the whistles of freight trains rolling through the southern part of the city. She knew it still wasn't too late to stop. She could carry both notebooks to the river and throw them away. She could resign from the estate, claiming poor health. She could disappear into another city and become invisible once more. Invisible people were always the easiest to lose. The following morning, she arrived at the estate earlier than usual. As she passed through the secondary kitchen to hang up her coat, she stopped. Resting on the corner of the kitchen table beside a stack of clean plates was June's glass jar, forgotten there the afternoon before. Inside, dozens of ocean blue paper stars rested together, filling the jar halfway. More than 40 tiny stars folded by 2 pairs of hands, one pair belonging to an awkward 8-year-old girl, the other to hands that patiently pressed every crease smooth. Taped across the top of the jar was a crooked little note written in colorful marker. 57 stars to go. Marin stood looking at that jar for a long moment. Then she removed her coat, tied on her apron, carefully tucked the wine-colored notebook back into the innermost pocket of her bag, walked to the West Wing reading room, found the white handkerchief, and folded it in half. That afternoon, while Marin knelt on the floor mopping the West Wing hallway according to the regular schedule, about 10 steps from the reading room door, the door eased open, and the voices inside drifted into the empty corridor. Once again, just as every other time during the past 3 years, nobody bothered lowering their voices because of a maid with her head bowed over a bucket of water. The first voice belonged to the bodyguard who followed Cormac like a shadow. "Sir, that maid has been spending time in places where she has no reason to be. Last week she stayed in the linen storage room twice as long as usual, and this morning our people saw her arrive almost an hour earlier than her schedule." Silence followed. Marin could clearly hear the faint rustle of fabric as the man in the leather chair shifted his position. Then Cormac's voice came, slow and even, almost like someone reciting a prayer. "Should we take care of her?" the other man asked. And Marin's heart slammed so hard she was afraid the sound would echo through the wooden floor. But her hands kept wringing out the rag. They kept moving along the strip of floor she hadn't yet finished, because stopping now would have been the same as admitting she was listening. "No," Cormac said, and that single word landed as lightly as someone flicking ash from a cigarette. "What are you thinking with? There are only 5 days until we sit down with Rizzo. Any disturbance inside this estate right now, even something as small as a maid slipping on the stairs, would be enough to make Gallagher raise every one of his instincts and start sniffing around every brick in this house. I need her asleep until Friday morning. I need this entire house asleep." Another pause, the soft tap of his gold ring against the wooden armrest. Then his voice dropped another level. "Wait until then. After Friday, clean up whatever you want." Marin finished mopping the hallway with hands that weren't allowed to shake, carried her bucket around the corner, and only after she reached the laundry room and closed the door behind her did she finally allow herself to lean against the wall and breathe. After Friday, clean up whatever you want. She understood she'd just overheard her own sentence being handed down, only with the execution postponed. And she understood something even sharper. The plan she and Ronan had been building for the following week, after everyone's attention shifted toward the peace meeting, had just died before it ever began. Because she no longer had a next week. All she had left was the time between now and Friday morning. And within that narrow window, the only opportunity for the room at the end of the West Wing hallway to be without its owner would come tomorrow night, Wednesday night, about 48 hours before the peace meeting. She knew that not because she'd overheard it, but because of her own hands. Earlier that morning, following instructions sent down from the advisor's office, she'd personally pressed Cormac's smoky gray suit, the one he wore only when leaving the estate for meetings he considered important, along with the message from the estate manager that the suit had to be ready before 6 o'clock the following evening because the car would arrive at 7. Tomorrow night, Cormac would leave the estate to meet someone important enough to justify wearing that suit, and only 2 days before the peace meeting, there could be only one person important enough to fit that description. Marin washed her hands, dried them carefully, then walked straight to the reading room, where the white handkerchief resting on the table beside the window was folded in half. Their meeting took place late that afternoon inside the glass conservatory behind the garden, where she watered the plants every other day, and Ronan occasionally took a walk before dinner. 2 minutes among rows of potted plants. The two of them stood on opposite sides of a narrow path. To anyone watching, it looked as though the master of the house had simply paused to exchange a few words with someone temporarily tending the garden. "He knows I'm watching," she said quietly while trimming away dead leaves. "He doesn't know what I've seen yet, but he's already given the order to wait. He doesn't want anything happening before the peace meeting. After Friday will be different." Ronan stood slightly, turned away, his eyes fixed beyond the glass toward the garden outside. Only the tightening of his jaw betrayed what he was feeling. "So there isn't a next week anymore," he said. "No," she answered. "But there is tomorrow night. He leaves the estate at 7 o'clock, the smoky gray suit. A car picks him up at the main gate. I think he's meeting someone from the south, and meetings like that never last less than 3 hours." He turned and looked directly at her for a single second. "How do you know his schedule?" Marin gave the slightest shrug, almost the first hint of a smile she'd shown throughout those days, stretched tight as wire. "Because I'm the one who pressed the suit he's going to wear, sir. You gentlemen keep your secrets locked inside safes, but you hand them to us through the laundry baskets." Ronan fell silent for a heartbeat, and something passed through his eyes that was equal parts surprise and respect. "Tomorrow night," he said, his words landing with the certainty of nails driven into wood. "I'll have Wade handle the outer perimeter with his own men. Nobody on the regular security schedule gets reassigned. Everything inside this estate stays exactly the way it would on any ordinary Wednesday night. As for you, you'll do exactly what you've done every single day. Not one extra step. Not 1 minute longer than your normal routine. Is that clear?" "Yes," she answered. He looked at her for another second, as though he wanted to say something else, then merely gave a small nod and continued along his evening walk. Marin bent down and finished trimming the last potted plant, her heartbeat gradually slowing beneath the scent of damp earth. Wednesday morning, the estate said goodbye to one very small traveler. June's grandmother arrived early to pick her up, exactly as planned at the beginning of the month. The little girl raced around the secondary kitchen saying goodbye to everyone, her pink backpack bouncing on her shoulders, her glass jar hugged tightly against her chest, because she absolutely insisted on taking it to show her grandmother. "Miss Marin, I'm going to fold more stars at Grandma's house. Grandma says we're making apple pie this weekend. I'll save you a really big slice." Marin knelt until she was at eye level with the little girl, straightened the crooked backpack strap on those tiny shoulders, reminded her to wash her hands before helping with the pie dough, and June wrapped her arms around Marin's neck in a hug that still smelled faintly of warm milk before skipping out to the waiting car, waving through the window until the vehicle disappeared behind the line of trees. Ronan stood on the front steps, watching it leave, and after the car had vanished into the distance, his eyes met Marin's across the courtyard for one brief heartbeat. Neither of them spoke, but both of them understood. The house now belonged only to the adults and the game they were playing, and tonight, when the clock struck 7 o'clock, the final 48 hours would begin to slip away. At 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening, from the small window of the first-floor linen room, Marin watched the black sedan roll through the main gate carrying Cormac Byrne away in the smoky gray suit she'd pressed with her own hands. She remained perfectly still for another 10 minutes, counting each slow breath, waiting until the taillights disappeared completely into the darkness beyond the trees before stepping away from the window. Her plan involved no ropes, no black gloves, none of the things people imagined from action films. It was woven from the only thing she'd truly possessed after 3 years of living as an invisible woman: familiarity. She knew the breathing rhythm of this estate as intimately as the lines in her own palm. She knew that every evening at 5 minutes before 9, the West Wing guard finishing the afternoon shift always left his post to walk downstairs to the secondary kitchen for his late meal. The night guard always arrived early, yet invariably stopped inside the guard room at the end of the hallway to change his shoes and hang up his coat. Between those two men, as predictable as the tide during the 3 years she'd watched them, stretched a gap lasting exactly 25 minutes, when the West Wing hallway belonged to no watching eyes at all. Only the camera mounted at the far corner continued recording exactly as it had every day for 3 years, capturing a sight so ordinary nobody had ever bothered rewinding the footage. A maid pushing a linen cart through the hallway to change towels and empty ashtrays according to the Wednesday evening schedule. At 5 minutes before 9, the footsteps of the departing guard faded toward the staircase, and Marin pushed her linen cart into the West Wing hallway. Her heartbeat remained slow and heavy, like a mallet striking thick cloth. She unlocked Cormac's room with the housekeeping key that had hung from her ring for the past 3 years, stepped inside, switched on the small desk lamp instead of the ceiling light, exactly as she always did during evening cleaning, and began doing the real work. She changed the pillowcases, emptied the ashtray, wiped down the desktop. Her hands performed the familiar routine while her eyes quietly measured every inch of the room, because if someone unexpectedly opened the door, all they'd see would be a maid halfway through changing the linens. Once the disguise was complete, she walked toward the liquor cabinet. The lower compartment of the cherrywood cabinet opened normally, revealing bottles resting sideways in their racks. But Marin wasn't looking at the bottles. She slipped her hand behind the back panel where, during one afternoon of dusting, she'd once tapped against the wood and heard a hollow sound unlike the surrounding wall. Her fingers traced the wooden edge until they found a crack as narrow as a thread. She pressed lightly against the left corner. The back panel swung silently outward on perfectly oiled hinges, revealing a hidden compartment about 2 handspans deep. The black leather ledger rested inside, thick, heavy, the corners polished smooth from frequent handling. A dark red ribbon marked the place where it had last been opened, curling slightly in the familiar way of something hastily tucked between the pages. Marin placed the ledger beneath the glow of the small desk lamp, removed an old phone from her apron pocket, its sound and flash already disabled before she'd left home, drew one slow breath, and opened the first page. She didn't have time to read. She only photographed, turned the page, photographed again, 2 seconds per page. Endless columns of figures, company names, dates, signatures ending in the same familiar flourish repeated over and over again. 27 pages in total, before she reached the dark red ribbon marking the place. 27 photographs stored inside an old phone that wasn't connected to any cloud anywhere in the world. Just as she was about to close the ledger, she noticed something. The back cover felt thicker than the front, unevenly thicker. As her fingers, accustomed to smoothing every surface they touched, traced the inner edge of the leather cover, the lining lifted slightly along one side. It wasn't torn. It concealed a hidden pocket, crafted with extraordinary care. Inside rested a small ivory-colored envelope. Later, Marin could never explain what made her open that envelope instead of leaving it untouched. Perhaps it was the lesson she'd learned during the confrontation, that the deadliest attacks never arrived looking like bullets. Perhaps it was the memory of 2 notebooks belonging to 2 different women lying side by side inside her thoughts. Whatever the reason, she opened it, and time inside that room simply stopped. 3 sheets of paper and 2 photographs lay inside. The first page was a handwritten receipt for a large payment made 3 years earlier. The description contained only a few words. Vehicle incident handling expenses. Ashland Bridge. Beneath those words rested the recipient's signature. The second and third pages contained more detailed records listing dates, times, and locations where the money had changed hands. The 2 photographs, taken from a distance but perfectly clear, showed Cormac Byrne standing beside an unfamiliar man next to a car. The other man held a thick envelope in his hand. Printed in one corner of the photographs was the date they were taken. Exactly 2 days before the clear afternoon, when Mrs. Gallagher's car had gone over the Ashland Bridge, standing in the room of her enemy, Marin suddenly felt her knees weaken beneath her. Inside her mind, the final page of the wine-colored notebook appeared with painful clarity, every deeply pressed stroke of handwriting returning to life. Tomorrow I'll give everything to R. I can't wait any longer. That woman had never reached tomorrow, and the man responsible hadn't destroyed the evidence. He'd preserved it, carefully sealed inside fine leather, as though it were another valuable possession, because to men like Cormac, proof of a partner's crime was the strongest chain with which to bind him. He'd kept those papers to control the killer he'd hired, never imagining that one day the very same chain would close around his own neck. For the first time that evening, Marin's hands trembled as she photographed every page and every photograph, taking 2 pictures of each item just to be certain. Then she forced herself to breathe steadily once more. She folded the envelope exactly along its original creases, slipped it back into the hidden leather pocket inside the rear cover, smoothed the lining until it looked untouched, returned the ledger to the hidden compartment, facing exactly the same direction as before, the spine outward, its bottom edge resting against the faint line of settled dust she'd memorized the moment she'd lifted it. And just before closing the concealed panel, her fingers, the same fingers that had folded every towel inside this estate into perfect lines for 3 years, the same fingers that had once smoothed hospital bed sheets while she still dreamed of becoming a nurse, performed one tiny movement that had never been part of the plan. They gently straightened the dark red ribbon that had been lying there with a slight twist, smoothing it flat, perfectly straight, perfectly orderly, exactly the way everything ought to be in her world. 3 seconds. A gesture as small as a grain of dust, as quiet as a breath. Her hand never even warned her mind, stretched tight as wire, that it had done such a thing. She closed the hidden panel, returned the wine bottles to their places, switched off the desk lamp, pushed the linen cart back out of the room, and locked the door behind her. By the time the night guard finished tying his shoes inside the guardroom and stepped into the hallway, the only thing he saw was the familiar stillness of the west wing carrying the faint scent of fresh floor polish. Downstairs, a maid quietly sorted dirty towels in the laundry room just as she had every Wednesday evening for the past 3 years. The only difference was that tonight, an old phone rested inside her apron pocket containing enough truth to bring down an empire, while upstairs, inside the hidden compartment behind the wall, A dark red ribbon waited in perfect, flawless stillness for its owner to come home. At 10 minutes before 10, with the lights throughout the estate already dimmed for the night and Cormac's black sedan still nowhere in sight, Marin carried a watering can into the glass conservatory behind the garden through the side entrance, where Ronan was already waiting among the rows of plants in the thin darkness, the garden lights filtering through the glass and washing everything in a pale blue glow like the bottom of a quiet lake. She didn't say a word. She simply placed the old phone on the rough wooden potting table, its screen already open to the photo gallery, then stepped back one pace. He picked up the phone and began scrolling through the first pages of the ledger with the cold, steady concentration of a man long accustomed to reading sins written on paper. 27 pages, endless columns of numbers, company names, the familiar flourish at the end of each signature repeating again and again beneath the glow of the screen. Every so often his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, as another figure aligned perfectly with an old suspicion, but he was still himself, a man quietly measuring the extent of the damage, until his finger reached the final photographs. The handwritten receipt carrying the words, "Vehicle Incident Handling Expenses, Ashland Bridge." The 2 photographs showing Cormac standing beside the unknown man near the car, the thick envelope in the stranger's hand, the date printed in the corner from 3 years earlier. The conservatory became so silent that Marin could hear water dripping from the automatic irrigation system in the far corner. Ronan said nothing. He didn't shout. He didn't smash anything. He did none of the things people imagined a crime boss would do after finding proof that the man he'd trusted most had murdered his wife. He simply stood there and read the receipt once more. Then once again. His free hand rested lightly on the edge of the wooden potting table, slowly tightening around the grain of the wood, gripping it harder and harder until his knuckles turned white beneath the pale blue light, and the thick tabletop let out the faintest groan, as though it could no longer bear the pressure. Marin remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, watching a man break apart inside without a single movement showing on the outside. Finally he spoke, his voice so quiet it barely seemed meant for her at all. 3 years. He sat at the dinner table with my daughter for 3 years. He straightened my tie at the funeral he arranged himself. He stood beside me at my wife's grave and put his hand on my shoulder. For 3 years, I poured that man whiskey from the very bottle he brought to mourn her. He set the phone back onto the table with terrifying gentleness. When he finally looked up, Marin saw something in his eyes that explained why an entire city lowered its head before him. It wasn't fire. It was ice. A decision already frozen solid. "Tonight," he said. "This ends tonight. The moment he comes back through that gate, it ends. I've owed my wife that for 3 years." He'd already turned toward the conservatory door when Marin's voice stopped him from behind. It wasn't loud, but it carried enough certainty to halt an avalanche. "Wait." He stopped. She stepped forward once, her heart pounding like a war drum, while her voice somehow kept the calm rhythm of someone once trained to deliver unbearable truths beside hospital beds. "I understand you owe her that," she said, "and nobody in this world has the right to tell you to wait. But please listen to me for 1 minute. If Cormac Byrne doesn't come back through those estate gates tonight, then tomorrow morning the entire city will ask why. Rizzo will ask why. And no matter how justified your reasons may be, the only thing the outside world will see is the Gallagher family executing one of its own just before the peace meeting. That's the excuse the South Side has been waiting years to find. And you won't be the only one paying the price for that excuse." She paused for a heartbeat before continuing even more slowly. "June deserves to grow up in peace. Don't let her become an adult in a city torn in two. She only just started smiling again. You know that better than I do." Ronan's hand remained motionless on the conservatory door. Marin took one more step toward him. "He's already handed us a weapon better than any bullet," she said. "Those 27 pages don't only record how he stole from the Gallagher family. They record the shipments and the money he stole from the South Side as well. He's been playing both sides. He's been deceiving both chessboards. So let him walk into Friday's peace meeting on his own 2 feet, confident, untouchable, never suspecting a thing. Then place those pages on the table in front of everyone and let the very code he worships judge him. You don't have to stain your hands. You only have to let the truth take its rightful seat." Silence stretched through the conservatory, so long that Marin thought she'd gone beyond the place a servant was ever allowed to stand. Then she saw the man's shoulders sink by the smallest fraction, barely an inch, as though a block of ice had chosen to settle instead of shatter. Ronan turned and looked at her. The look lasted longer than every previous meeting of their eyes combined. "Do you realize no one has ever stood inside my house and told me to wait?" he said. "I'm not telling you to wait," Marin answered. "I'm telling you to win." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't enough to become a smile, but it wasn't ice anymore either. "All right," he said. "Friday. At the peace table. Your way. Tonight I'll have Wade make 3 separate copies of every one of these images. This phone doesn't leave your possession until Friday morning. He believes paper never betrays its owner. Then let his own papers speak the final words." He glanced at his watch. 10:15. Cormac's car would return within the hour. The two of them left the conservatory through separate exits, like two shadows dissolving into the night garden. Neither of them knew that the thing destined to decide everything over the next 48 hours wasn't hidden inside Wade's 3 backup copies, nor inside the old phone resting in Marin's apron pocket. It remained perfectly still inside the hidden compartment behind the liquor cabinet in the West Wing, waiting upon a dark red ribbon that had been smoothed perfectly flat by hands that had spent a lifetime making everything beautifully, dangerously orderly. Thursday passed through the estate like every other Thursday, and that was exactly what both of them wanted. Towels were folded, floors were polished, coffee was poured. The white handkerchief in the reading room rested neatly in its 3-fold position, signaling that everything was calm. Yet beneath that perfectly still surface, Marin Foley was doing the one thing her years in nursing school had carved into her more deeply than any lecture ever could. She was preparing for the worst. Her instructors had always said that a good nurse wasn't someone who believed the shift would be quiet. A good nurse was someone who'd already stalked the emergency cart while the hallway was still silent. The first thing she did came during her lunch break behind the closed door of the laundry room. She took her old anatomy notebook from her bag, the hardcover volume with worn corners she'd brought from her rented room that morning, the only piece of her unfinished dream she'd never let go. She sat looking at it for a long moment on the ironing table. It was nearly the same size as the black ledger, nearly the same thickness, the same dark hard cover. It weighed almost exactly the same in someone's hands. Most importantly, it was a genuine notebook filled with page after page of dense handwritten notes, the sort of thing that would force anyone opening it in haste to spend several precious seconds realizing what they were actually holding. And in certain situations, a few seconds could be worth an entire fortune. She wrapped the notebook inside the oilcloth she normally used to line damp shelves, folded it into a neat square, tied it securely, then stood quietly studying the laundry room with the eyes of someone searching rather than hiding. Finally, she chose the hollow space behind the broken clothes dryer that had stopped working the previous year, where a narrow gap existed between the wall and the ventilation duct, deep enough to conceal something, hidden enough that anyone searching would have to work to find it, yet not so impossible that it would seem unnatural. She understood the strange truth her years as a maid had quietly taught her. The best hiding place wasn't somewhere nobody could ever discover. It was somewhere that, once discovered, made the finder believe they'd won. The second thing she did came later that afternoon, during the 20 minutes assigned to organizing the warehouse archive cabinet, where an old desk stood outside the view of every camera. She opened the old phone and carefully reviewed all 27 photographs, the way a nurse counted medication before administering it. Then she did something that hadn't been part of any plan she'd discussed with Ronan. She divided the images into 2 groups. The first remained complete. For the second, she chose only the pages documenting money flowing through the shell company registered in the dead man's name. The figures, the dates, the signatures ending with that familiar flourish. Not a single page connected to the shipments. Not a single page naming anyone from the underworld. Nothing that could reach the Gallagher family or the south side of the city. Only the simple story of one man with dirty money and documents that didn't know how to lie. A language another world beyond those iron gates understood perfectly well. She saved that second collection onto a separate memory card, wrapped it carefully in plastic, taped it beneath the bottom of the small sewing kit inside her personal locker, and quietly told herself in the same gentle inner voice she'd always used to calm herself through sleepless nights. This isn't betraying anyone. This is the final door. If every solution inside this world fails, another door still exists outside it, and the key to that door should belong to someone with nothing left to lose, except her conscience. Early the following morning, while running an errand outside the gates, Marin quietly dropped a sealed, padded envelope containing a duplicate of that memory card into a public mailbox, addressed to the federal prosecutor's office. That evening, during the final 2-minute window before the peace meeting, at the corner of the first-floor hallway, where she was dusting picture frames while he walked toward the garage, Marin slipped the first memory card containing all 27 pages into Ronan's hand during a handshake lasting less than 2 seconds. Then, in the same even voice she'd used for ordinary work schedules, she quietly reported, "Everything's untouched. The real ledger is still behind the liquor cabinet, exactly where it belongs. He came home at 10 minutes before 11 last night, and this morning he was still turning his ring while drinking coffee as though nothing had happened. He doesn't know anything." "Good," Ronan answered softly. "Wade has already made 3 backup copies. Tomorrow I'll bring the printed documents. He won't know until those pages are lying on the peace table in front of him." During the brief moment before they parted in opposite directions, his eyes rested on her face for 1 heartbeat longer than usual. "Get some sleep tonight. Tomorrow I'll need those eyes clear." The words sounded like an order, yet landed with the quiet gentleness of someone asking another person to take care of herself. That night, before switching off the light in his office, Ronan made one phone call that had nothing to do with the game awaiting them tomorrow. He called June at her grandmother's house. Her cheerful little voice burst into his ear like a flock of sparrows. "Daddy, my first batch of cookies turned completely black because I kept folding stars instead of watching the oven. But Grandma said only the second batch counts. I folded 11 more stars today, and Grandma says mine puff up prettier than anyone else's." He listened to every word without interrupting or rushing her. He laughed out loud exactly once when she described the burnt cookie as looking like a lump of charcoal shaped like a heart. "Sleep well, sweetheart," he said at last. And for the first time in 3 years, those 3 simple words left his lips without dragging behind them the silent emptiness that always opened every night in the hallway beyond his daughter's room. Because tonight, inside the locked drawer of his desk, rested the answer to the Ashland Bridge. And only 1 day remained before that answer would finally be spoken aloud where it belonged. He turned off the light. The estate slipped into its final Thursday night sleep. Peaceful, orderly, folded as neatly as a handkerchief with 3 perfect creases. No one inside that house knew that in the West Wing, behind the silent liquor cabinet, a perfectly smoothed, dark red ribbon was quietly waiting for morning. At 5:30 on Friday morning, while the estate still lay beneath the gray silence that came before dawn, Cormac Byrne was already seated at the desk inside the room at the end of the West Wing hallway, his shirt buttoned neatly to the collar, doing the one thing he'd always done before every major game during the past 15 years. He opened the hidden compartment behind the liquor cabinet, placed the black leather ledger on the desk, and reviewed every figure one final time before the day that would decide everything. He opened the cover, reached for the ribbon marker to turn directly to the page he'd been following, and his fingers stopped halfway. The dark red ribbon lay perfectly flat between the pages, smooth, straight, immaculate, as though it had just been pressed with an iron. Cormac Byrne couldn't remember many beautiful things in life, but he remembered his own bad habits with absolute precision. He knew he always tucked that ribbon into the ledger with one hurried motion, and for 30 years, in every notebook he'd ever owned, the marker ribbon had always remained twisted, always curled, always bent in the middle like a small snake asleep. He sat perfectly still before the open pages for a long time, without touching anything else. He simply stared while the gears inside the old fox's mind began turning backward. Who could have entered this room? Who had a key? Who stood beside this liquor cabinet every day without leaving the slightest ripple across the security schedules he studied every morning? The answer appeared so simply that he almost laughed. The maid. The maid who folded everything perfectly straight. The maid his own men had reported lingering in places where she had no business being. The maid whose stack of $50 receipts had forced him to admit she was more careful than he'd expected. He opened the back cover and traced the leather lining. The ivory envelope still rested inside its hidden pocket, exactly where he'd left it, untouched. But that brought him no comfort. Anyone clever enough to find the hidden compartment would have certainly found the concealed pocket as well. And if the contents of that envelope had already become photographs, then those photographs could only be in one man's hands. Yet Cormac Byrne didn't panic. Panic was a luxury reserved for amateurs. He straightened in his chair, poured himself half a cup of cold coffee, and began calculating. If Gallagher had possessed those photographs before yesterday, he wouldn't still be sitting here peacefully drinking coffee. That meant the break-in had happened recently, no later than Wednesday night, while he'd been meeting with the South Side, which meant Gallagher was holding his cards and waiting. Waiting for what? The peace meeting, of course. Destroy him in front of Rizzo. One arrow through two birds. And once you understood your opponent's move, the only thing left was getting there one step first. At 10 minutes before 6, he lifted the desk phone and called Sal Rizzo's secretary with the smooth confidence of a man who'd spent 15 years serving as an advisor. He explained that Gallagher's people had received intelligence suggesting possible security concerns near the restaurant and recommended moving the peace meeting from 11 o'clock to 9 in the morning for the safety of both sides, a reason no sensible man could refuse. Then he called Ronan. His voice carried the flawless tone of loyal concern. "Sir, the South Side has requested a change of time. 9 o'clock instead of 11. We should leave earlier." The line remained silent for 2 seconds before Ronan's calm voice answered. "Fine. Tell Wade to prepare the cars." At 6:10, Cormac unfolded the weekly security schedule prepared by his own office, and with 3 brief phone calls made under the authority of coordinating the peace meeting convoy, he reassigned the morning guard from the service gate to assist the motorcade, instructed the next shift to cover the post, but delayed its starting time, everything perfectly legitimate on paper, creating a 40-minute gap during which the rear service gate would stand completely unguarded, from 10 minutes before 7 until 7:30. Then, at 6:15 in the morning, using the second phone still taped beneath the desk inside the small second-floor office, the snake marked long ago without his knowledge, Cormac sent a brief text message to 3 numbers without names. The 3 men he'd hired the previous week for work intended to happen after Friday. The message contained only one sentence. Orders changed. This morning, service gate open from 10 minutes before 7. Recover 1 notebook from the Maid. It's hidden somewhere in the rear buildings. Get it no matter what. Leave no trace. At 5 minutes before 7, the convoy departed the estate through the main gate. Ronan sat in the rear seat carrying the leather briefcase filled with printed copies of the evidence. Wade drove the lead vehicle. Cormac rode in the second car, watching the estate slowly disappear in the rearview mirror, with the expression of a man who'd just finished arranging every piece on the chessboard. At exactly the same moment, behind the estate, Marin pushed the laundry cart toward the service gate checkpoint, just as she did every Friday morning, carrying a stack of receipts requiring the guard's signature. She stopped cold before the checkpoint window. Inside, the guard station was empty. The swivel chair still sat slightly turned, as though someone had only just left it. The shift log lay open across the desk with that morning's page completely blank. Not a single signature written upon it. She stood there, surrounded by the sounds of early morning birdsong, while an icy feeling slowly spread through her chest. Across 1,001 mornings during the past 3 years, this checkpoint had never once stood empty during this shift. The Friday morning guard was an elderly man so punctual that his coworkers joked people could set their watches by him, and if a gap appeared on the very morning of the peace meeting, at the most secluded gate of the entire estate, then it wasn't coincidence. It was a door deliberately opened by someone, and doors like that were opened for only one kind of visitor. Her hand slipped into her apron pocket and closed around the old phone. With the movements she'd rehearsed again and again in her mind, ever since agreeing upon their signal, she called the unnamed number, let it ring twice, then disconnected. She called again. 2 rings. Disconnected. She counted a full 5 seconds of silence. Then she placed the 3rd call. 1 ring. Disconnected. 2 missed calls. A pause. 1 missed call. She had barely slipped the phone back into her apron pocket, her hand not yet leaving the fabric, when she heard it. From the rear courtyard beside the service buildings, where the long perimeter walls stretched dark shadows across the early morning sunlight, came the sound of footsteps. Not 1 person, 3, from 3 different directions, slow, even, closing in. The notebook, the man standing in the middle, said, his voice low and dry like stone grinding against stone. Hand it over, and nobody has to make trouble for anybody. The 3 men had stopped just close enough that they didn't need to raise their voices, yet far enough that none of them could reach the other in a single move. Their guns hadn't been raised. They rested casually at their sides like dark punctuation marks beneath the early morning sun. They'd come here under one very clear order. Recover it first. And Marin Foley stood in the middle of the rear courtyard beside the laundry cart, the stack of delivery receipts still in her hands, realizing in a single heartbeat that those very orders were the only narrow opening through which she might survive. They needed the notebook, which meant they still needed her alive and talking. As long as she possessed something she could give them little by little, the clock would keep moving. She let the receipts slip from her fingers. The papers scattered across the courtyard exactly as much as they should. No more and no less. It was another strange skill those semesters spent in hospital corridors had taught her, that a person could be frozen with terror inside while keeping a voice calm and steady, because there were rooms where one trembling voice shattered everything else along with it. "I know what you've come for," she said, slowly lifting both hands until they rested at chest height, her palms open. "I don't carry it with me. Nobody's foolish enough to carry something like that on them. It's hidden in the rear buildings. I'll take you there." Then she looked directly into the eyes of the man standing in the middle, the only one whose gaze belonged to someone making decisions. "I only ask you one thing. When it's over, let me leave. I'm only a servant. What you want is hidden inside a wall, not inside me." The man studied her for 3 long seconds, 3 seconds during which she could hear the blood rushing through her own ears. Then he jerked his head. "Walk. Keep your hands where I can see them." Their formation immediately tightened around her like a moving vice. One man walked ahead to her right. The man giving orders stayed directly behind her left shoulder. The third sealed off the rear. They moved with the smooth coordination of men who'd worked together for years. Marin walked steadily across the courtyard toward the service buildings. Every step became another second. Every second became another beat she silently counted inside her mind, the way she'd once counted the rhythm of intravenous drips. Slow, steady, don't stumble. The guide who stumbled lost her value. At that very moment, 7 miles south of the estate, the 2-car convoy was crossing the river bridge when the unnamed phone inside Ronan Gallagher's jacket vibrated twice before falling silent, vibrated twice again. Paused for 5 full seconds, then vibrated one final time. The man sitting in the rear seat didn't even need to look at the screen. He already knew the world had just shifted on its axis. The truth was, he'd begun suspecting something shortly before 6 o'clock, when Cormac's perfectly polished voice had informed him about the changed meeting time. 15 years sitting beside that man had taught him Cormac never announced a change without offering 3 explanations and 2 alternatives. Yet this morning there'd been only one brief sentence. Years earlier, when Ronan was still a younger man, he'd once told his father that whenever a peace meeting was suddenly moved at the last moment, the trap was either waiting where you were going or waiting where you were leaving. So from the moment the convoy had rolled away from the estate, he'd already instructed Wade's independent security team to shadow them from half a mile behind, like nameless ghosts who appeared on nobody's security schedule. Ronan tapped 2 fingers against the driver's seat using an old signal. His driver eased into the emergency lane halfway across the bridge for exactly 15 seconds, just long enough for a lightning-fast exchange. Wade stepped from the lead vehicle into the rear seat of the boss's car, continuing toward the peace meeting, carrying the decoy leather briefcase, and presenting the familiar silhouette behind the dark-tinted windows, so any eyes counting vehicles would still see the Gallagher convoy moving south in perfect formation. Meanwhile, Ronan stepped into the unmarked gray vehicle belonging to Wade's independent security team, which pulled alongside 30 seconds later. The moment the door slammed shut, he spoke only 4 words: "Turn around, rear gate." Then he looked at his watch. 3 minutes before 7. 8 minutes back if they ignored every traffic light. And 8 minutes, he knew, was more than enough time to lose everything. During those same 8 minutes, inside the rear service building, Marin pushed open the laundry room door and stepped into the familiar smell of soap and damp air that had sheltered her for 3 years. She pointed toward the broken clothes dryer standing in the corner. "Behind it," she said, "the gap beside the ventilation pipe, wrapped in oilcloth." The man guarding the rear remained at the doorway while the one in front squeezed into the corner, braced his shoulder against the heavy dryer, and slowly forced it away from the wall inch by inch. The iron feet scraped harshly across the tile floor inside the silent room. He reached into the narrow darkness and pulled out a square package wrapped neatly in oilcloth and tied with crossed strings. Marin stood with both hands still raised before her chest, watching her carefully prepared contingency plan buy another few precious drops of time. She counted silently. How much longer? 4 minutes. 3 minutes. She didn't know exactly. She only knew the ticking clock inside her mind wasn't allowed to stop. The man in command snatched the package away, dropped it onto the ironing table, sliced clean through the strings with his knife, tore away the oilcloth in 2 swift movements, and revealed beneath the fluorescent light a thick, dark, covered notebook, heavy in the hand, its worn corners exactly like those of a volume carried and used for many years. For half a second, Marin saw his shoulders relax with quiet satisfaction, and she held her breath. He opened the cover. The first page, lying beneath the harsh fluorescent light, contained no columns of numbers at all. Instead, it held an old pencil drawing of a complete human skeleton stretching from skull to feet, every bone carefully labeled in the neat handwriting of a nursing student. Clavicle, sternum, 12 pairs of ribs. Along the margin, another small line had been heavily underlined twice. Final exam next week. You can do this. The laundry room fell silent for one heartbeat that seemed to last an entire lifetime. The man stared at the page, flipped another sheet, then another, then another. Bones, muscles, arrows, notes. Slowly, his head lifted from the notebook and turned toward the woman standing in the middle of the room. In the eyes of the man making decisions, only one decision remained, and it was already taking shape. At that exact moment, from the courtyard beyond the service building, cutting through the wall and the smell of soap, came the sound of heavy iron hinges as the courtyard gate slowly swung open, deliberate, heavy, and completely unhurried. The man guarding the rear was the first to leave the laundry room. His pistol came up to chest level as he slipped into the hallway of the service building to investigate the sound, and what he saw in the courtyard beyond froze him in the doorway. A man was crossing the yard alone, unarmed, the front of his coat hanging open in the cool morning breeze. His footsteps neither hurried nor slow upon the stone pavement. What sent a chill through the seasoned gunman's spine wasn't the way he walked. It was the silence. The man didn't shout. He didn't call out. He didn't bark a single order. He didn't even bother looking at the gun aimed in his direction. He simply kept walking straight ahead as though this courtyard, these buildings, this morning, and all three intruders were nothing more than pieces of furniture inside his own house, and furniture didn't require greetings. 3 seconds later, the gunman understood why. From 3 different directions around the service buildings, beyond the perimeter wall, beside the warehouse, and from the path leading around the garden, figures dressed in plain gray clothes stepped away from the background almost simultaneously. There were no shouted commands, no running footsteps. Positions simply closed around the courtyard as quietly as the incoming tide. Within a single heartbeat, every exit from the yard had someone standing in it. Their weapons remained lowered but ready. Their faces belonged to men none of the 3 intruders had ever seen in any file concerning the estate. They'd memorized every security schedule, counted every guard. They'd been promised an open gate and deserted service buildings. They'd prepared for everything except an army that officially didn't exist. By the time the leader inside the laundry room heard his partner stepping backward, it was already too late. The laundry room door swung open, and the man stood there, filling the doorway. His eyes swept across the room once, over the anatomy notebook lying open on the ironing table, over the clothes dryer shoved away from the wall, before finally stopping on the woman standing in the middle of the room with her hands raised before her chest. His gaze remained there for exactly 1 heartbeat, just long enough to confirm she was unharmed. During that single heartbeat, Marin saw something inside those icy eyes soften before instantly freezing solid once again. What followed happened so quickly that later she could never remember the exact sequence. The gunman closest to the door raised his weapon and was instantly seized from both sides by 2 men in gray before completing the motion. The man who'd pulled the notebook from behind the dryer was slammed face down onto the tile floor in the next instant, cleanly and decisively. No shots were fired, only the clatter of metal striking the floor and the sharp sound of an arm being twisted behind a back. The leader, the man with the eyes that made decisions, stood in the middle of the laundry room looking slowly around him, counting the guns aimed at his chest, measuring the distance to the door, making the final calculation of his professional life. Then, very slowly, he lowered himself onto one knee, placed his pistol on the tile floor, and pushed it away with the back of his hand. At that moment he understood something no amount of money could ever compensate for. He'd accepted a job to intimidate a maid and recover a notebook. Now he was kneeling inside Ronan Gallagher's territory, in the very home of the man whose name made the entire city lower its voice. Ronan stepped into the room, walked past the kneeling man without bothering to glance downward, and stopped before him with the quiet authority of a judge. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't any louder than someone reading from a list. Yet the temperature inside the laundry room seemed to fall several degrees. "You came into my house," he said slowly, every word landing with deliberate weight, and pointed guns at one of my people. My people. Those 2 simple words struck the tile floor of the laundry room, and Marin heard them with perfect clarity through the smell of soap and damp air inside the place where she'd spent 3 years eating lunch alone. Something warm surged behind her eyes, and she had to blink twice before forcing it back. For 3 years as an invisible woman, she'd belonged to this room, to the laundry cart, to the neatly folded towels, but never, not once, had she belonged to anyone. "Their phones," Ronan said to the commander of the gray-clad security team. 3 devices were immediately placed upon the ironing table. The first contained nothing, the second held only unnamed numbers, but the third phone, belonging to the man who'd given orders, still displayed the message received at 6:15 that morning. Orders changed. This morning, service gate open from 10 minutes before 7. Recover 1 notebook from the Maid. It's hidden somewhere in the rear buildings. Get it no matter what. Leave no trace. The sending number, once Ronan read it over the phone to Wade, who was already nearing the peace meeting in the decoy convoy, took only 10 seconds to identify. It belonged to the prepaid phone still taped beneath the desk inside the small second-floor office. The snake they'd marked weeks earlier and deliberately left untouched while waiting for the day it finally struck. 6:15, Ronan repeated quietly, while the clock inside his mind rewound the entire morning. 10 minutes before 6, Cormac had called to change the meeting time. 6:15, Cormac had ordered these 3 men back to the estate, which meant the supposed security threat near the restaurant had been fabricated, which meant the entire morning had been one hand reaching out to pull him away while the other slipped inside his house. And best of all, the timestamp displayed openly upon that phone screen was evidence no denial could ever erase. "Photograph everything," he ordered. "The message, the number, the time received, everything." One of the men in gray completed the task in exactly 60 seconds, sending the photographs both to Wade's phone and to Ronan's unnamed device. Ronan remained standing in the laundry room for another brief moment, looking at the 3 bound men seated against the wall, before turning toward Marin. In front of everyone present, he spoke to her with the same voice he used inside boardrooms, rather than laundry rooms. "Stay here. My people are around you. No one will lay another hand on you. I have an appointment I need to keep." As he passed her on his way toward the door, he slowed for half a step and lowered his voice until only the 2 of them could hear. "That notebook," he said without taking his eyes off the doorway ahead. "After all this is over, I want you to tell me how it managed to save the entire game." Then he stepped into the courtyard, climbed into the unmarked gray vehicle, and when the driver asked whether they should run every red light to make up the lost time, because 9 o'clock had long since passed, and everyone at the restaurant would surely be watching the clock, Ronan Gallagher leaned back into the rear seat, straightened the collar of his coat, watched his estate slide away beyond the window beneath the fully risen morning sun, and answered, "No. Drive the normal speed. Let them wait. Today I want to arrive exactly 20 minutes late." And for the very first time that morning, a faint expression crossed the face of the man who'd terrified 3 armed killers without lifting a single finger, an expression that looked remarkably like a smile. At 9:20 on Friday morning, the heavy wooden door of the private meeting room behind the restaurant swung open, and Ronan Gallagher stepped inside a room already steeped in poison someone else had carefully brewed. Around the long table covered with a dark green cloth, Sal Rizzo sat at the head with his 2 senior lieutenants beside him, the old patriarch of the South wearing a face carved from stone. At the seat to the right on the Gallagher side, Cormac Byrne was just finishing the performance he'd spent the past 20 minutes carefully staging, the regretful shakes of his head, the polite remarks about how young men no longer respected proper manners, the way he'd glanced at his watch before sighing. Every gesture designed so that by the time the door finally opened, every eye around the table had already been prepared to greet the late arrival as though he were declaring war. "Mr. Gallagher," Rizzo said, his voice as heavy as rolling stone, "where I come from, we don't keep a peace table waiting for 20 minutes. Ronan didn't answer that remark. He didn't even take the empty chair waiting for him. Instead, carrying the leather briefcase in his hand, he walked slowly along the edge of the table, opened the clasps, and laid 2 stacks of papers upon the dark green cloth directly before Sal Rizzo. The first stack was thicker. It contained printed copies selected from the 27 photographed pages, reduced to include only those involving the South Side, Rizzo's shipments that had been deliberately undervalued on paper, the missing money flowing into the shell company registered under a dead man's name, figures only the South Side itself could verify. Not one sentence, not one word, touched the internal affairs of the Gallagher family. The second stack contained only a single sheet, a screenshot of the text message displaying the sending number, the order instructing someone to recover a notebook from the maid at the Gallagher Estates service gate, with the clearly visible timestamp showing it had been received at 6:15 that very morning. "I arrived 20 minutes late," Ronan said in the calm voice of someone reading official minutes, "because 3 unexpected visitors came to my house this morning, following the instructions in this message, sent at 6:15, exactly 15 minutes after someone called both me and your people to move today's meeting forward. Take your time reading it, Mr. Rizzo. Paper never hurries." The room fell into the kind of silence where someone could hear the tablecloth brushing against a shirt cuff. Sal Rizzo put on his glasses, lifted the thicker stack of papers, and began reading. He read slowly, turning each page with thick fingers, sometimes lingering over a single figure for a very long time, while the 2 lieutenants beside him leaned closer, their expressions darkening with every page. Those numbers required no explanation. They represented the Southside's cargo, the Southside's money, and the distinctive flourish ending each signature at the bottom of those documents was one everyone around that table had seen hundreds of times over years of business between the 2 halves of the city. Then Rizzo picked up the second sheet, the screenshot of the text message. He studied it for exactly 10 seconds before laying it back upon the table, removing his glasses, and turning his head very slowly toward the man seated on the right side of the Gallagher delegation. Sal Rizzo's silence weighed more heavily than any threat that room had ever heard. He asked no questions. He slammed no fists upon the table. He raised no voice. He simply looked. Beneath that gaze, Cormac Byrne, the old fox who'd survived 15 years, the man who'd rearranged the entire chessboard that very morning with only 3 phone calls, sat perfectly straight in the smoke-gray suit. Marin herself had carefully pressed. His hand performed the familiar movement it always made whenever his mind was racing at full speed. His fingers reached for the gold ring and began turning it, 1 rotation, then another, searching for an escape through the calculations that had sustained him all his life. Blame forgery, yet the signatures ending with his distinctive flourish appeared on documents belonging to both sides. Accuse Gallagher of planting evidence, yet the text message had been sent from the private phone only he used, at an hour only he himself had arranged. Plead innocence before the South Side, yet the documents plainly showed he'd been stealing from them while simultaneously stealing from the Gallagher family. By the time the ring began its 3rd rotation, it stopped halfway. His fingers released it. They settled quietly upon the dark green tablecloth. For the first time in 15 years, every calculation returned the same answer. Nothing. There wasn't a single move left. No one pronounced judgment. In that world, judgment wasn't spoken aloud. Sal Rizzo merely turned his chair slightly aside, enough for his back to face the seat on the Gallagher side. At precisely the same moment, Ronan Gallagher picked up his leather briefcase, walked to his own chair at the opposite end of the table, and sat down without once looking in Cormac's direction. The 2 halves of the city turned their backs simultaneously, as quietly as 2 doors closing. Cormac Byrne remained seated alone inside that empty space for another 10 seconds, before rising to his feet, slowly fastening the button of his suit jacket with careful fingers, and walking the length of the room beneath the eyes of people who didn't even bother lifting their heads. No hand reached out to stop him inside the room, but as the heavy wooden doors closed behind Cormac, 2 quiet men from Rizzo's crew fell in step right behind him. In that world, not being stopped by the boss meant you were handed over to the street, and his freedom had ended the moment he crossed that threshold. The peace meeting that followed was brief and direct. The 2 remaining men seated at opposite ends of the table spoke the language of men who'd simultaneously discovered they'd both been robbed by the same hand. And when they finally shook hands shortly before noon, the city beyond the restaurant windows remained completely unaware that it had just escaped being torn in half. 1 week later, on a Thursday morning, federal vehicles pulled up outside a hastily rented apartment on the western edge of the city, and federal agents escorted away a gray-haired man charged with money laundering and tax fraud through a company registered in the name of a deceased individual. The investigation, as the brief article in the local newspaper explained, had begun with financial documents delivered anonymously inside an envelope bearing no return address. Meanwhile, at the estate in the north, inside the laundry room, a maid quietly read that article on her phone during her lunch break. Then she opened her locker, looked at the sewing kit that no longer contained the small object once taped beneath its bottom, closed the locker again, and said nothing to anyone. The final door had opened exactly when it needed to. through a hand belonging to neither of the two worlds that had been fighting over the city. People later said that inside the detention center, Cormac Byrne became the quietest prisoner in the entire block. He never bargained through lawyers, never asked to see anyone, never spoke a single word about the 15 years hidden behind the iron gates of the northern estate, because no one understood better than he did the final calculation still standing. Speak about the Gallagher family, and he'd personally lead federal investigators to the foot of a bridge. Among every remaining door left in his life, the prison cell turned out to be the only place where he could still sleep. As for the receipt connected to Ashland Bridge and the 2 photographs, they never appeared in any official file. Ronan kept them locked inside the drawer of his desk. One quiet weekend afternoon, he drove alone to the cemetery on the eastern side of the city and stood for a long time before a granite headstone. There were no flowers, no candles, only a man lowering his head to speak one very short sentence to the woman resting beneath the grass, words the wind carried away before anyone else could hear them. Justice for his wife ended exactly like that, without fanfare, without headlines, as quietly as the careful woman herself had once pursued the truth through the straight-ruled lines inside a wine-colored notebook. 3 weeks later, on a quiet morning early in the month, Marin received a letter from the finance office at St. Anne Hospital. She had to read it 3 times before she could believe the words printed on the page. Every remaining dollar of the medical debt in her name had been paid in full. Whoever had made the payment had left no name, only a brief note in the description line, compensation with retroactive effect. She sat for a long time at the folding table inside her tiny rented room, the letter resting beside the worn expense notebook that had followed her for 3 years, its pages filled with steady entries of $50 payments. This time, she didn't call the hospital to request the money be returned as she had before, because she knew whose hand stood behind that note, and she also knew those words had been written in a way that left her no room to refuse. It wasn't a favor. It was payment for work. Payment for a nameless job she'd carried out in the shadows through months when nobody had ever known. And because of that, she decided to resign. She wrote her resignation letter on Sunday evening. The words were brief, respectful, and grateful, because she understood herself better than anyone else ever could. She had spent her entire life paying every debt with her own hands, and she didn't want to remain inside that estate as someone new, someone whose employer felt indebted to her, someone people would look at with sympathy mixed with admiration. She'd rather become invisible somewhere else than stay there as someone others pitied. On Monday morning, she placed the letter upon the desk in the second-floor office. The man sitting behind the desk read it in silence without looking surprised, almost as though he'd been expecting it all along. Then he opened a drawer, removed a cream-colored folder, and slid it across the desk toward her, exactly the way he'd once pushed across the anonymous note and the brown file. Only this time, what rested upon the desk wasn't a question or an accusation. It was an admission package from the nursing school. Fall semester. The very program she'd been forced to abandon. The enrollment had already been officially confirmed, and attached to it was a receipt showing that the tuition for the entire program had been paid in full. Marin stood motionless, staring at the documents. When she finally looked up to speak, Ronan spoke first. His voice remained as level and direct as ever, the voice of a man who'd never cared for unnecessary words. "This isn't a gift," he said. "I don't give gifts. This is payment for the 14 months you spent doing a job nobody ever hired you to do. A job my entire security department, despite drawing full salaries, failed to accomplish. You gave me back my home, the truth about my wife, and peace for my daughter. Compared to those things, paying for one education means I still owe you more." He paused, and for the first time since she'd known him, the man seemed uncertain before finishing a sentence. His fingers lightly brushed the edge of the desk before falling still again. "As for this resignation letter," he continued, "I'll sign it. You're free. You were never someone being held here. But before you decide where you'll go next, I have one question, not as your employer." He looked directly at her, and inside those eyes that were usually as cold as ice rested something remarkably close to hope. "Next Tuesday, June still wants pancakes," he said quietly. "Will you still be here?" The room fell silent for a long moment. Marin looked at the man sitting behind the desk. She looked at the cream-colored folder. She looked at her own resignation letter. Then she heard the answer leave her lips as softly as a breath she'd been holding for a very long time. "I will." And so, on the following Tuesday afternoon at 3:15, outside an elementary school on the north side of the city, Among parents waiting beneath rows of trees whose leaves had begun turning gold, stood a young woman in the new position she'd accepted. The person responsible for picking up and caring for June Gallagher after school each afternoon, work she would do while attending morning classes at nursing school once the fall semester began. When the school gates finally opened, a little brown-haired girl burst from the crowd of children like a tiny arrow, her pink backpack bouncing behind her while she hugged a glass jar raised triumphantly above her head. Miss Marin. Miss Marin. My jar of stars won second place in the whole class. My teacher said my stars were the puffiest and folded the neatest. I only lost because Mia decorated hers with glitter, but I don't need glitter. Grandma says beautiful stars come from careful folds, not decorations. Oh, and Miss Marin, my second batch of apple pie with Grandma turned out perfectly. I saved you the biggest slice in the box. Grandma also said I have to learn how to fold everything as neatly as you do. Marin knelt until she was level with the little girl, accepted the glass jar now filled with 100 blue paper stars, straightened the crooked strap of her backpack, then gently took the small hand that still carried the faint scent of classroom chalk and walked beside her down the sunlit golden street toward the waiting car. As June chattered happily beside her, Marin found herself thinking about the road she'd traveled, and about something perhaps people could only truly see after surviving their darkest days. The world wasn't really held together by the powerful men seated high above everyone else inside wood-paneled rooms. It was held together by people everyone believed were invisible, the ones who still noticed what nobody asked them to notice, the ones who remained kind when no one was watching to praise them, the ones who quietly chose to do what was right when silence and turning away would have been 100 times easier, because doing nothing was also a choice. And every choice carried its own weight, a weight a person would carry for the rest of life. Kindness, however, was never loud. It was like the paper stars inside that glass jar, folded one by one in silence, every crease made carefully straight, every day adding another star. No one noticed. No one counted. Until one day you looked up and realized the jar had become full, and its quiet light was warm enough to illuminate an entire lifetime. And so the story of the invisible maid and the most powerful man in the city comes to its end here. If this story touched your heart, we'd be grateful if you'd like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel to enjoy many more unforgettable stories every day. We'd also love to hear what you think about Marin's journey, about the choice she made when the whole world treated her as though she were invisible. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd truly be honored to read every heartfelt word you choose to share. Thank you for staying with us until the very last line of this story. We wish you and your family good health, joyful days, and a life filled with peace and quiet happiness. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in our next video.